Welcome to the East Bay's best podcast, The Capstone Conversation. This is a show that interviews political, government, and community leaders in Alameda, Contra Costa, and Solano counties. We look at what is going on in your city, how are we developing things economically, and where are we going from here? I'm your host, Jared Ash. Welcome to today's episode. Usually we are talking about what is happening in the East Bay related to government and our community. So we've had some nonprofit leaders, we've had a number of mayors, some city staff on. Today, we're going to take a totally different look and talk about college football and what is the impact here in the East Bay and to the Pac-12, which included UCLA and Oregon and Arizona. How does that impact UC Berkeley, which is here in the East Bay, and just what do college football fans overall need to know? And I thought this would be an interesting episode as it does affect the East Bay. And it's just a fun topic to talk about in the heart of college bowl season, which we are entering today. So I am joined by a gentleman who was the former Associate Athletic Director for Communications for the University of California at Berkeley. He is since retired, but Herb, I'm going to ask you to come in, and why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself further today?
So, thanks, Jared. Happy to be here and to talk about a subject that I'm sure is on a lot of people's minds, and it certainly spurred a lot of discussion over the last several months since some decisions were made. As you said, I was the Associate Athletic Director for Communications at Cal. Started at Cal in 1990 after previous stops at the University of Texas and the University of Tennessee, and then worked my way at Cal with virtually all 30 teams at some point, primarily with men's basketball, women's swimming, and football, probably the three sports I spent the most time with, probably tossing softball for my early part of my career. And then handled a lot of executive communications too for the athletic director or working with chancellor's office, things of that nature, before I retired about a year and a half ago after almost 33 years on campus.
And I want to just put in the disclaimer, since Herb is retired, he's talking for himself and we're just having a casual conversation about football. This does not represent the university in any official capacity, but I also thought that would be a little bit more fun today. So Herb, tell us what happened to the Pac-12, right? It was an elite conference this year. Supposedly it had one of its best years in a decade or more. How did it break up? What's the history here?
So that's a big question. And 108 years of history is virtually going away with all but two of the schools leaving the Pac-12. Oregon State and Washington State are still there. They're trying to figure out their best way forward. And we could certainly address that if you want to later on in terms of where they're moving. But a lot of this has to do with television and television money and not a lot of logic in terms of where schools ended up. I think where this really started was with the decision of my alma mater, Texas, and Oklahoma deciding to go to the Southeastern Conference and leaving the Big 12, that they felt there was a more competition. There's certainly more revenue in that way. And there was also the timing then was a lot of the conference's television contracts were coming due. And so a lot of the discussion out there is how much were networks like Fox and ESPN involved in some of these things that were happening. But after Texas and Oklahoma left, and that was in the summer of 2021, and it happened 3 weeks after a new commissioner, George Kliavkoff, took over at the Pac-12. So when we got to that point, it was coming due for the Pac-12 TV contract to be renegotiated on that. And almost a year later, USC and UCLA announced they were going to jump and go to the Big Ten. And I think that really threw a lot of things into a bit of turmoil and a lot of uncertainty, because these are two of the biggest names, not the two biggest brands in the Pac-12 from a national standpoint on that. But television contract negotiations continued and continued. Nothing was announced. And then it was almost coming to a deadline this past summer to announce that for it. And just before it was announced, or got to the deadline, Colorado decided it was going to go back to the Big 12, where they had been before they joined the Pac-12 about a dozen years ago. And then there was a proposal put on the table for TV revenue, and some of the schools didn't like it. And so Oregon and Washington took an invitation from the Big Ten and went there. I believe they're getting reduced revenue. They're not getting a full share of what all the other schools are getting. And then almost immediately, three more schools, Arizona State and Utah, jumped to go to the Big 12. And that left four: Cal, Stanford, Oregon State, Washington State left in the Pac-12. And they each had to figure out what was their best way forward. Cal and Stanford were able to secure an invitation from the ACC, and the Oregon State, Washington State have just announced in the last week or so a partnership for scheduling for football with the Mountain West Conference. So you've got schools that were linked together for many years, some over 100 years, but now they're scattered throughout the country. And I don't think we've seen the end of the shift that we're going to see in college sports with some of this conference alignment here.
Yeah. And it's interesting that two schools within 30 minutes of the Pacific Ocean have joined the Atlantic Coast Conference. That's as far away as you get, right? Previous to this move, the furthest west I believe you had was Louisville, which is an outside of the Atlantic Coast by itself, was pretty far away compared to schools in Florida, Boston, the Carolinas, and Georgia.
Yeah, that's where I said you have to throw some logic out the window there. I do want to add too that SMU has now joined the ACC, so they will be part of that as well. In talking to and listening to people at Cal for the decisions why they did what they did to make that choice, there were three criteria that they were looking at. One was to continue to compete at the highest level. Cal and Stanford as well have two large, broad-based athletic programs. Cal has 30 sports. Stanford, I think, has 36. And they succeed in a vast majority of them at a high levels. They win national championships, produce Olympians and Olympic champions. So it was important to continue to compete at that level. In addition to sports, certainly like football and basketball, that they're probably more the revenue drivers for it. They were looking for like-minded academic schools. And I think they found that in the AC with some very strong academic schools. You look at like Virginia, Duke, North Carolina, and you could just go down the list that academically they fit very well. And so where do you turn for something like that? And the ACC was it. And the last part was revenue. Cal and Stanford are taking reduced shares that will slowly increase to get to on par with the other ACC schools. SMU is actually taking no revenue or television revenue early on.
That was the deal. Television revenue for SMU, but in exchange, their alumni raised them $112 million within 48 hours.
Yeah, that's a school that does have a very strong alumni base for that. So anyway, looking at those three criteria, the ACC turned out to be the one that Cal and Stanford felt was best for them for that moment and really for the long term for that. My understanding is they talked to certainly coaches, alumni, and student athletes would get some input on what they were thinking before Cal made that jump. But ultimately, that was the decision that they made. You look at Washington State, Oregon State that had decided to stay sort of right now as part of a Pac-2, but partnering with the Mountain West Conference. There's a lot of uncertainty there. There's a court case going on with those two schools against the 10 remaining Pac-12 school over future distributions and assets at the Pac-12, and a lot of uncertainty. I don't think anybody knows what that outcome is going to be either. I don't know that they necessarily have the options out there for Cal and Stanford. I don't think there were options to go to the Big Ten or the SEC or the Big 12 for that matter. And so the ACC really was probably the one and best option for them, given those three criteria that I just mentioned.
And why not? Why? And I know you don't have the insight, you're not in the room in the AC, but why not just absorb Oregon State and Washington State as well? I mean, you're already traveling across country for most teams. Sure, they're another half an hour flight, but not significant. Why not just roll them in?
I think part of it was television revenue. Again, that in order to add schools to it, the existing conference schools wanted to ensure that it was worthwhile from a TV revenue standpoint. And I believe that their contract with ESPN is actually going to increase given the addition of Cal, Stanford, and SMU. So there are some opportunities for additional distributions that may not have been there previously. Adding Washington State from their standpoint, they probably felt that wasn't going to add to that revenue. Again, I wasn't in the room, so I can't say with certainty, but it would be my best guess for that.
Yeah, and I've read that Clemson was one of the teams that their athletic director voted against the ACC merge. And his argument was really not about Cal and Stanford joining. It was more about their contract and the ACC with ESPN. They felt that they're getting significantly less revenue to the tune of like $30 million a year for their teams compared to the SEC and Big 12 conference.
Yeah, as I mentioned, TV revenue is so much of the driver here. I think one of the unfortunate things with college football in particular, but you could probably say college sports in general, as you look at this conference realignment and what that's going to mean for everybody, is there's nobody really looking out for the good of the sport overall, particularly in football. The NCAA doesn't have a say in terms of what conference affiliations are there. So you were looking at schools that were looking at what's best for me and making decisions based on that. And I think throwing tradition and some of the other things that help college sports thrive out the window. And that's where you end up with this. And where do we end up in the long run? I don't know. I mean, there have been talks or rumors about schools that want to leave conferences again because they want to try to get additional money, but there are tremendous buyouts to get out of conferences now that there are other conference TV contracts on that. And so I don't know that we'll see anything right away, but a lot of the speculation is that by the end of the decade, we're going to see more shifts for where that's going to be. Again, there's other court cases out there. I know this gets very legal that could blow up the model as well in terms of paying student athletes, were they employees? Is there back pay owed to them? What does all that look like? And again, that's working itself through the courts and we'll see where that turns. I think if you'd said this 2-3 years ago, would we be in this shape or this space right now? I don't know that people would have thought this is where we'd be. So who knows where we'll be in 2, 3, 4, 5 years from now as well.
Yeah. So keep looking for realignments I'm hearing in there. So let's talk about the student athletes, right? You're talking about 2 schools here in the Bay Area that now again, right, have to fly into Louisville. There's no direct flights in that path anywhere. Have to go into Tallahassee, Winston-Salem, small towns, not near big airports. Miami, okay, maybe that's a little easier. It's still a 6-hour plane ride. It's 8 hours of travel altogether. How does that affect student athletes?
That's a big concern that's out there. And I don't think there's anybody who's not concerned about what that would look like. From a Cal standpoint, of the 30 sports they have, 19 sports are going to be not affected at all or minimally affected. That's because a lot of them, there's a number of sports that are not sponsored by the ACC, so they'll continue to compete against teams primarily on the West Coast. Beach volleyball, for example, will be doing that. Men's water polo will. Cal just won the national championship 3rd year in a row over the weekend. And ACC does not sponsor men's water polo, so they'll continue to compete against the same schools they always have out here. Same thing with women's water polo and a handful of others that are that way. And then there's one sport that Cal sponsors, field hockey, which because there's only 3 schools on the West Coast that play the sport, they've actually been members of the America East Conference for the last several years. So the fact that they're going to the ACC probably won't affect their travel because that's already happened. They've been playing a lot of East Coast games for that. But there's a number of things, mitigating factors, I think, that are being looked at right now in terms of how to minimize the travel and the impact. One is use of charters and to get away from having to make connections, like you mentioned, trying to get to Louisville on a nonstop flight. And so the estimate I'm here is about $4 to $5 million additional in travel costs for something like that. That's going to have to get absorbed. But there's other things that they're looking at. One is possibly playing games in Dallas with SMU and bringing teams there, so it shortens the flight a little bit, putting multiple teams on charters. So it could be 2 or 3 Cal teams together flying out. So that way it's only one flight instead of multiple ones and you get some coordination and scheduling, or even the possibility of Cal and Stanford flying together. So that way, if you're going to, I'm just throwing it out there, say it's basketball and one team's playing Duke and one's playing North Carolina, why not be on the same plane to do that? They're actually A number of years ago, Cal did that for a couple of years, chartered flights with Stanford basketball going up to Oregon. So the teams would go up and play Oregon and Oregon State, one on Thursday, one on Saturday, and then they'd flip the locations. And so the teams would fly up together and fly back together. Also did it on the Washington State weekend as well. So it's not unheard of, but we may see more something like that as we look at the travel, probably carrying more tutors and advisors on there to help with that. But certainly there's issues you have to consider, physical toll, mental toll for people that are students that are missing class or the long flights like that, late nights, things of that nature. And it's all going to have to be worked through. And I don't know that there's any clear-cut answers at this point, but I know that it's certainly being discussed at a high level to figure that out.
I mean, it makes sense, right? If you can go in and even if you go in with multiple teams and you could play basketball and men's and women's even, and you could do 2 games at Duke and then go to NC State, right? Both in North Carolina, and then even North Carolina, do 3 games on the road and stay away for 6 or 7 days, then fly back. Well, here's the problem. If you stay away for 4 days or 6 or 7 days, it's when did you go to class in the middle of all of that? It's these other sports play more often than football games.
Yeah, that's where some of it is. One of the things they're looking at as well is trying to schedule maybe more road trips during winter break. So Cal, being on a semester system, doesn't start classes until after the first 2 weeks of January. So maybe try to get some of those games in during that period when they're on break and look at it more from that standpoint to try to minimize the amount of class time missed. But I think inevitably that's going to happen. And it's not unique to Cal. It's the same thing. You're looking at all the West Coast schools that are now playing Eastern time zones. SC, UCLA, Oregon, Washington as well. These are much longer road trips than what they used.
One thing I found interesting is that I think you said 15 or 17 sports don't actually join the conference. So what happens when you're not in a conference? And what are some of those examples of sports?
So it's really about 19 sports won't be affected a whole lot. So for example, golf already plays pretty much a national schedule. You go to a tournament at a golf course and 10 to 15 teams from around the country come play there and you play it. So the only time they may have to go all the way back to the East Coast would be for the AC Championship. Other than that, they're still playing the same number of tournaments that they would be out here. There's also a conference out here called the Mountain Pacific Sports Federation, the MPSF, that has sponsored sports that aren't really sponsored by the larger conferences out there. And so that's where you've seen things like water polo, beach volleyball had been in something like that. Men's gymnastics, maybe something of that nature would be in there. And so they would continue to compete as they have, just not part of the ACC. Cal's rugby team, there isn't men's rugby equivalent in the ACC. So they'll continue to compete as they always have. And there's a handful of others as well. I just can't think of them off the top of my head right now.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. So there was recently a meeting at Cal related to the students where the students got to hear from university leadership about this. And that was a public meeting, but they shared some insights into that. Is there anything you could share about that meeting?
I think the meeting was an online meeting, and it's actually, if anybody who's listening wants to find out more, you can go to berkeley.edu and then search for campus conversations. And there was the online discussion included the chancellor, athletic director Jim Knowlton, the faculty athletic representative, and the chair of the academic senate, just to talk about a variety of different issues that are out there. Some of these we've already talked about, a couple of things that we really haven't a whole lot. And some of this is generating more revenue. How is that going to happen? So one is the UC regents have met a number of times about whether UCLA should pay its sister school, Cal, because of the lost revenue due to the breakup of the Pac-12 or the loss of revenue from the Pac-12 initially because of their departure and how much is that going to affect it. The regents haven't determined how much money that's going to be, but we expect that to be decided fairly soon. That's one area of revenue that's going to be there. Another one is looking to see if there are more revenue opportunities at Memorial Stadium, ways to host more events that are there. A number of years ago, Cal hosted International Soccer Friendly as part of a tournament and it's sold out, 63,000 people. There are limits to the number of large events that can be held there just because of some covenants with the neighbors to have more events like that as a revenue opportunity. And there may be some other ones that are there as well. The other thing that the group at Cal's doing is they're talking to a lot of their colleagues at the ACC, both in the conference office and at the individual schools, in terms of what are some things maybe that they're doing that Cal's not doing right now to take care of additional support for student athletes that way. So I think they're trying to learn a lot at this moment for what's there, but it's challenging, and there's no way around that. And I think they've got some hard decisions that have to be made, but there is a little bit of time before all this takes place starting at the end of next summer.
Yeah, well, I'll disclose I am, for those of you who can't see my background, I am a Florida State Seminole alumni, and I'm excited because this puts more Florida State teams out here into the Bay Area, which is very hard to see. And I'm excited to go see our basketball team. I'm really excited. They've released the football schedule, and I think we play in at Cal and 2026 at Stanford. So I know that's still a ways away, but my mother-in-law is also a Cal Bear alumni, and she said that she will get us all tickets for that game. And I'm excited because I feel like we're playing an A team in Seminoles versus the B Cal Bears team. She won't be excited that I said that, but it's exciting. It's exciting to see my team out here. That'll be good. And I will also say that I'm very frustrated because we are recording this right after the CFP playoff announcement, where a 13-0 Florida State was left out of the college football playoffs. The first team in more than 30 years who went undefeated in a Power 5 conference is not going to have a chance to play for a national championship. So I'll let you weigh in on all of that.
That's an awful lot right there. But I think the point of Florida State coming out here and other ACC schools coming out this way for their alumni, Cal's looking at the same thing. There's a lot of East Coast alumni who went to school in Berkeley. A lot live in the New York area and the DC area, other places east. So it's an opportunity to engage more with alumni on the East Coast, because they'll be regularly seeing Cal teams coming out, whether it's football, basketball, or you name it. They're going to be out that way.
All right. What else should we be talking about with the Pac-12 and its impact here?
One thing I think that we haven't really talked about a lot is that just part of it has been the conference upheaval and all the changes there, but there have been a lot of changes in athletics or college athletics over the last several years. And I think any one of them would have been monumental in its own right, but they're all happening at once for that name, image, and likeness, which allowing student athletes to be able to earn money off of their name, image, and likeness, that they can now make money for what they're doing and what they may be worth. We're seeing no real guardrails around that. It's a lot of people in college athletics are looking for the federal government to set some kind of guidelines on that. State governments have certainly chimed in, and there's different rules everywhere. But you're looking at quarterbacks maybe having to be paid $1 million. And this is all from non-athletics funds, so alumni and others. Maybe that's the going rate. Or I saw one story that said that a starter on a Power 5 team probably should be making close to $100,000 a year. This didn't exist just a few years ago. And it's continuing to grow on that. And then you've also got others that are opportunities because of whether they're social media influencers or you see them in advertising, because they're big names and they're worth it to the advertisers. And it's not just the prime TV sports, football and basketball, but you're seeing a lot of others as well, men and women, that are making some money that way. The other one is the transfer portal. It's a lot easier to transfer now. So it used to be you would sign your letter of intent with the school and you were there for your 4 or 5 years, and rarely would you see transfers. Now, 25% or so of student athletes out there transfer every year, or they put their name in the portal and they look for better opportunities. So if you're not starting, you go look somewhere else. From a student athlete standpoint, it opens it up a little bit more. If you're in a situation you don't like or it's not good for you, it's easier to move on. But if you're from a team standpoint, you may not know what your team's going to look like from year to year. You develop a player for a year or two, and then they go jump somewhere else to go play. But we're seeing that in all sports, and the transfer portal's just opening up now in football, and you're going to see hundreds and hundreds of student athletes there. They're going to be transferring. And then just the impact of television. I just think that's just putting more and more money into the sport. And where does it go from here? There may be a limit on what's going to be there. There's certainly a changing face of cable But are we going to see more streaming or other things out there as this continues to develop? We move forward for the next few years.
Yeah. So a lot to take in on those. And you're right? If one school can somehow have alumni or an advertiser spend $100,000 per athlete, $1 million on a quarterback, is that more tempting than for somebody to go there? And are they recruiting a better team? And you see that at some private high schools and high school football. But it could make a big difference to schools that have very wealthy alumni that come from more metro areas, that might have corporate headquarters there. All of those things can play a difference. It could keep kids in college maybe another year. So there's a lot to take on that. On the transfer portal, I mean, I saw this morning, right? Ohio State starting quarterback, Oklahoma's starting quarterback, 2 schools, one in the top 10, one in the top 20, that their quarterbacks are moving on to a different university. So there's clearly something there that they don't like. Those were already starting quarterbacks. But I've seen a backup running back say, hey, look, I'm not getting enough playing time here. I think I could get more playing time at another university. So you see a lot of people jumping in. And what is it? Deion Sanders' team at Colorado this year was like 95% of the team came from a transfer portal.
Yeah, it was a big number for something like that. But it also is allowing some schools going through rebuilding to try to bring in some new talent. I look at the Cal men's basketball team right now, Mark Madsen, what he's trying to do, and brought in 4, 5, or 6 transfers this year, and a number from Power 5 schools, and they're making an impact. They're finally getting healthy. So we'll see where they end up for the rest of the season. But it's every sport. And some people find a better location, a better spot for them. Unfortunately, some people go into the transfer portal and they don't find a landing spot. So there is a bit of a risk by doing that as well.
Right. Because you said to your team, I don't want to be here anymore. And yeah. Any predictions for Cal and Stanford in the year to come here? I want to make some bold analytical predictions here. How are certain sports going to do?
I think they're going to be energized. I think it's exciting. It's something that's new. And the Pac-12, it was conference of champions for so many of these years. And so much of that was built off of the Olympic sports. And I think that's one area where it's going to be really competitive, and it'll be interesting to see how they do. Football and basketball and others, and really down the line, everything's so new. So you're trying to build some new traditions and new rivalries and see where that all takes you. In terms of how they're doing the ACC, I don't know if I want to be one making predictions on that, but I think there's some level of excitement because it is going to be new as much as maybe leaving behind a few of the teams that you played all the time. You're going to a new location and hopefully have some fun that way.
That's great. And I appreciate that. And I'm excited just when you talk about other sports. I guess I reference football a lot, but I know tonight my ladies Seminoles, as they're called, are playing in the national championship in soccer on December 4th when we're recording this. This would be for our 3rd national championship, I think, in 5 years in soccer. So the ACC does have a lot of caliber in other sports, always known as a basketball conference.
And they're playing Stanford, so it's a future conference opponent right there. So there you go.
There you go. All right. Herb Benenson, former UC Berkeley Associate Athletic Director for Communications. I appreciate you joining us here on the Capstone Conversation. This episode will be right before New Year, so I want to wish everybody a happy and healthy New Year. And I look forward to having you continue to listen in January. Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Herb.
Thank you.
Please hit subscribe so you get the weekly updates of when we release the next episode. I'd like to thank our sponsors, Capstone Government Affairs and Economic Development, a firm where I serve as managing partner. For more information, check us out at www.capstonegov.com and follow us on LinkedIn by typing in Capstone Government. Check out the show notes, and for a full transcript, visit our website, www.capstonegov.com, and follow us on LinkedIn by typing in Capstone Government, or you can find me, your host, Jared Ash.